In this video, let's get an overview of a firewall, an IDS sensor. IDS, that's an intrusion detection system sensor. And we'll also talk about a honey pot and a honey net. First up, a firewall. And we typically think of a firewall as sitting between a corporate network and the internet. So if an attacker launches an attack against the network, then that firewall is going to detect that malicious traffic coming in, that's violating some rule it's not allowed in, and it's going to drop that offending traffic. And there are several different types of firewalls. One could be a host-based firewall. Many operating systems today have a firewall built in to the operating system itself. A very basic type of firewall is called a packet filtering firewall. And here we're talking about something as simple as an access control list that we might have on a router. And this typically doesn't work very well when we have a firewall sitting at the internet boundary between the corporate network and the internet. For example, let's say that we had a client inside of the corporate network and they want to go out to an internet site. Maybe we have our packet filtering firewall set up such that traffic originating on the inside of the network is allowed to go out to the internet, but traffic originating on the internet is not allowed to come back into the corporate network. Now that might sound okay at first, but if we think deeper, what happens when that client inside of the company tries to go out to that website? Well, the traffic is originating from inside, so that traffic is allowed to go out of the firewall and reach that web server on the internet. Here's the issue though. When that return traffic attempts to come back from that web server on the internet, the packet filtering firewall is going to say, oh, I've got an access control list that says traffic coming from the internet is not allowed back in. So that doesn't really do much good to the inside user. They don't get the web page because that content coming from the internet-based web server was blocked. What would be better for a situation like that is a stateful firewall. With a stateful firewall, the firewall inspects traffic that might be going out to the internet. It notices the source and destination IP addresses and port numbers. And when it sees return traffic come back from the internet, with those addresses and port numbers transposed, it realizes, oh yeah, this is part of that very same session, so I'm going to allow it back in. It knows the state of the session. It knows that this is not a session that originally began on the internet. It's just return traffic from a session that began inside of the network. We can also have next generation or layer 7 firewalls. And these vary in their feature sets, but here are a few examples of what they might do. They might look beyond just IP addresses and port numbers to recognize a particular session. There may be some applications that change port numbers. They change protocols during the session. For example, let's say we're setting up a voice over IP phone call. Well, the initial portion of that phone call might be using the SIP protocol, the session initiation protocol, to get the call set up. But once the call is set up and we start streaming the voice, well, that voice is going to be carried inside of RTP, the real-time transport protocol, a different protocol than SIP. But if we have a firewall that understands the nature of voice applications, it can see that RTP traffic and realize it's part of that session that originated with the SIP protocol. And these next-generation firewalls could have other features such as content filters to block objectionable content. They might even have an intrusion prevention system sensor built in, and we'll be talking about that in just a few moments. But in this example of a firewall, notice that we have two ports on the firewall. There's the inside network and there's the outside network going out to the internet. However, sometimes we might want to have a third zone. This third zone is oftentimes called the DMZ, for the demilitarized zone. What we're doing with the DMZ is putting resources that we want to be reachable from the internet. For example, the company might have their own web server or email server at their site, and the firewall should allow traffic to come in to those servers. Those are publicly available servers. Now, we may set up the firewall to only allow certain ports in to give a level of protection to those locally hosted servers, but we're putting those servers in a different zone than the main corporate network or the inside network. We don't want an attacker to compromise, for example, the web server, and then use that as a hopping off point to attack the corporate network. So devices inside of the DMZ cannot initiate connections to a device on the inside. Here's an example of where I've used this before. I used to be a network administrator at a university, and we had a DMZ, and in that DMZ we put students in their residence halls. That way they received some protection from the internet. They were behind the firewall. But the faculty and staff, they were on the inside network. And the students in that DMZ, they could not initiate connections to resources in the faculty and staff network, which had the servers for the various colleges within the university. And that's an overview of a firewall. Now let's consider an IDS sensor, or an intrusion detection system sensor. Notice the IDS sensor is plugged into a switch, and that switch is going to be configured for port mirroring. So traffic going through that switch is going to be copied and sent to the IDS sensor. Let's say we've got traffic coming in from the internet. It hits that switch. It makes a copy. That copy is sent down to the IDS sensor, and the original traffic is sent on to the client. Now, let's say that was malicious traffic, and the IDS sensor noticed it was malicious traffic because it matched a signature of a well-known attack. Well, what that IDS sensor might be able to do is send instructions up to the firewall saying, hey, that was malicious traffic that just came through. You want to block traffic coming from that device out on the internet. So when the next packet comes in, the firewall is now going to block that. But an IDS sensor is going to inspect, and it can react to a copy of received traffic. In other words, it's not sitting in line with the traffic. It's getting a copy of the traffic. A device that does sit in line is called an IPS sensor, or an intrusion prevention system sensor. In this case, notice that we've got malicious traffic coming in from the internet, and if it does make it through the firewall, that IPS sensor might say, whoa, this matches the signature of a well-known attack, and that traffic gets discarded before it ever reaches the client. And in some cases, there can be damage done to the client with just one or two packets. They're called atomic attacks. In a case like that, an IDS sensor might not be sufficient to protect the client. But here, the IPS sensor is inspecting and reacting to traffic in line. It's comparing that traffic to a signature database. And in this example, I'm showing an IPS sensor as an appliance, and it can be an appliance, but sometimes we can put an intrusion prevention system sensor on the client itself. That's called HIPS, which stands for Host IPS. Next up, let's talk about honey pots or honey nets. This is a way that we can set up what appears to be a valuable resource, but we don't fully secure it. Now, why would we do something like that? Well, if we set up a honey pot, that could be a server that does not contain any sensitive information, and it's not secured very well. So if an attacker is probing our network and they're looking for weaknesses, they're going to see that honey pot, and they're going to start attacking that honey pot. But it doesn't contain any sensitive information, but by the attacker going after that honeypot server, we're going to be able to monitor their attack methods. That's going to better educate us about what we need to defend against. And with a honey net, instead of having just a single server as a distractor, we've got an entire network, maybe a subnet with multiple devices that is acting just as a distraction subnet. And with this honeypot or honey net, not only are we monitoring the attacker's methods, we're also consuming their time. We're distracting them from high-value targets so we can better prevent them from getting to those high-value targets. Now, that's an overview of a firewall, of an IDS and an IPS sensor, and a honeypot or honey net. In our next video, we want to take a look at how an attacker might evade one of these firewalls or an IDS sensor. In this video, let's consider how an attacker might attempt to evade a firewall or an intrusion detection system sensor. First, let's consider a firewall. The attacker might begin by trying to gather information about that firewall and see if there are any known vulnerabilities to that firewall. And to gather that information, if they're able to see a login screen or a welcome screen when somebody connects to that firewall, maybe via an SSH session, they could do what's called banner grabbing. They could take a look at the banner information, which might give a clue as to the type of firewall they're dealing with, and maybe even what version of operating system is running on that firewall currently. They might also do just basic port scanning. See if there are any firewall holes that the attacker might use to send traffic through. Some companies want certain ports to come into their firewall because people on the outside, maybe their remote staff, they need to access specific inside resources, and they're going to do so over a certain port or collection of ports. If an attacker can find those open ports, which again are often referred to as firewall holes, they might be able to leverage that to launch an attack. And we talked about firewalking earlier. This is where an attacker might use something like traceroute to see where a firewall is located within a network. I have to go through 2 routers, and then it looks like we have a firewall, and then another router beyond that. They could do that firewalking using the traceroute command to see architecturally where does that firewall reside in relation to other routers. And once the attacker has gleaned some information about the firewall, they're going to start to try to evade it. One way is to spoof their IP address. Maybe there is an IP address that is allowed through the firewall. There's a firewall rule that says, yep, this IP address is good, we'll allow it through. Well, the attacker might pretend to be that IP address and get through the firewall. Or they might conceal their IP address so nobody traces the attack back to them by bouncing their attack off of a proxy server. A proxy server might be based somewhere on the internet, and it's going to receive the incoming request from the attacker and then re-originate the request going towards the company. So if the attacker does find a firewall hole as an example, they might direct their attack going through one of those holes, going to that specific port number that's open. They might direct that attack to a proxy server and have the proxy server send the traffic into the company. So when the company is saying, hey, who is sending this malicious traffic? The IP address that shows up is the IP address of the proxy server, not the attacker. They might also use source routing. That's a method where someone can specify the exact path that's going to be taken to get to a destination network. Instead of using the routing tables that are built into a router that are populated maybe by routing protocols, with source routing, we can specify exactly which path we want our traffic to flow, and that path might be bypassing a firewall. Also, if there is an open port, such as HTTPS, or maybe pings are allowed using ICMP, if the attacker finds protocols that can get through the firewall, they might use those allowed protocols to encapsulate their malicious traffic. And earlier we talked about session hijacking. Well, let's say that an allowed device, in other words, an approved host, has a session set up through the firewall currently because they're allowed. What if the attacker hijacked that session? Suddenly they're allowed through the firewall as well because they have taken on the identity of that allowed system which has already gone through the firewall. Next, let's consider some IDS sensor evasion techniques. One is a denial of service attack on that appliance. Maybe the attacker overloads the IDS sensor's CPU by sending just an overwhelming amount of traffic, and it's going to overwhelm the processor of the IDS sensor. Maybe the attacker sets up multiple connections, and each of those connections, that's going to consume some memory inside of the IDS sensor, and if we have too many connections set up, that's going to consume all of the memory in the IDS sensor. Or the attacker might be targeting the operator, the human that's keeping an eye on all these different alerts. If they see dozens and dozens of alerts going off at one time and they're trying to track down what's going on, they might not see the actual attack that the attacker is launching because they're having to deal with this multitude of alarms that are currently going off. Something else an attacker might do is to do a low bandwidth or a fragmentation attack. Let's think about how a packet might be fragmented. If a packet is too big, for example, it exceeds an MTU, then we might fragment it. We might chop it into different pieces, and each of those pieces have their own header, and they have an identifier that can allow the fragments to be reassembled. And let's say that the IDS sensor has a timeout that says, if I receive a packet or a fragment, and I receive a subsequent fragment that's part of the original packet, if it doesn't arrive within a certain amount of time, I'm not going to consider it to be associated with that first fragment we saw. So with a low bandwidth attack, we take a packet, we break it up into fragments, and we send those fragments spaced out to the point where we're exceeding the timeout value on the IDS. But maybe we're not exceeding the timeout value of the target host inside of the corporate network. So the IDS sensor might not see these fragments as being combined into something malicious because they're spaced too far apart, but the host may reassemble them and be receiving malicious traffic. An attacker might also do insertion or evasion. Those are sort of the opposite of one another. That's when the attacker sends traffic that's handled differently on the IDS sensor and on the host. For example, with an insertion attack, the attacker might be sending traffic that intentionally has a checksum error. That might be accepted by the IDS, but it might be rejected by the host. Or the converse of that is an evasion attack. Here, the attacker is sending traffic that is rejected by the IDS sensor, but it's going to be accepted by the host, such as overlapping fragments. In other words, the IDS sensor might not detect that those overlapping fragments could be combined into a malicious packet, but the host can. Another evasion technique is called obfuscation. This is where the attacker is going to encode the payload of their malicious traffic such that it's not going to be interpreted correctly by the IDS sensor. They might do that by using a specific encoding scheme that perhaps the host can decode, but the IDS sensor cannot decode. Or the attacker might have an encrypted session set up between themselves and their victim, the host inside of the corporate network. And even though the host is going to be able to decrypt that traffic, the IDS sensor is not going to be able to. Or the attacker could do something called polymorphism. This is where their attack pattern is not going to be matching a signature of a well-known attack because they have morphed the malicious traffic into a form that it's not going to be recognizable, even though it's having the same effect. And that's a look at a few ways that an attacker might attempt to evade a firewall and an IDS sensor. In our previous video, we discussed some ways that an attacker might evade a firewall or an IDS sensor. So in this video, let's consider some ways that we might stop an attacker from evading the firewall or the IDS sensor. First, we can evaluate how things are configured right now. We might do our own port scan to see, do we have any firewall holes that an attacker might exploit? Do those holes really need to be in place? Could we come up with a better set of rules instead of just leaving these ports open all the time? And to prevent an attacker from gleaning information about a firewall based on a secure shell connection to that firewall, we might want to take a look at the banner and make sure it's not giving away information that could be used by the attacker. We mentioned that an attacker might do firewalking to see where the firewall resides within a network. Are we going through two routers to get to that firewall, for example? Well, we might consider turning off ICMP echoes on that firewall so it's not going to respond to those trace route probes. We also mentioned that an attacker might spoof their IP address. To help prevent IP address spoofing, we might want to enable URPF. That's unicast reverse path forwarding. This is where a router is going to take a look at an incoming packet and it's going to say, all right, it claims to be from this source IP address. But if I were to send traffic to that address, which interface would I use? And if that interface that the router would use to send traffic to that IP address is not the same interface on which that IP address was received, it realizes that something is up and it's going to block that traffic. We might also disable source routing, so an attacker cannot specify a path that goes around a firewall. We talked about the low bandwidth attack, where we send fragments spaced so far apart, the IDS sensor does not reassemble them. Well, we might want to adjust the timers on our IDS sensors so that they can see those fragments, even if they're spaced far apart, and realize they're part of the same packet. And we might want to tell the IDS sensor to do reassembly of fragments so we can recognize those malicious packets. And it's a good idea to periodically review the firewall policies we have set up. Let's make sure that each rule needs to be there and it's an appropriate rule. It's not too strict or it's not too lenient based on business needs. And one of the big things we need to do with an IDS sensor is keep that signature database updated. We might have a routine where we periodically, maybe on a weekly, maybe on a daily basis, we update the signature database, or the IDS sensor might support a service where it can get near real-time information from a threat monitoring system on the internet. One we mentioned earlier, something that Cisco uses, is called Cisco Talos. And that's a look at some best practices for how we can help protect a network against an intruder evading our firewall or IDS sensor. In this video, let's consider how we or an attacker might go about detecting a honeypot, which might not be very easy because a honeypot is designed to look like a legitimate system. So how do we know that this is a distractor system versus an actual Linux box, for example? Well, we could look for some suspicious characteristics. Maybe this system is very easy to break into, suspiciously so. Maybe as we do a port scan on that system, it has lots of open ports. And while that might suggest we're connecting to a honeypot, we might just have a very poorly configured system that we've broken into. Something else to look for, though, is A relatively small amount of data as you peruse the directories and you take a look at the users. You don't have many users, you don't have a lot of data. That's another indication that this might be a honeypot. Additionally, we could turn to some honeypot detection software. As just a few examples, there's one called HPing, and I'll put the download URL for each of these on screen. There's the Send Safe Honeypot Hunter and Nessus. And something else that can help us detect a honeypot is to become familiar with some different honeypot software out there, so we can know what it's looking for and how it behaves. And as just one example, let's consider a honeypot that we could run on Microsoft Windows. It's called KF Sensor. And as you can see in the left-hand pane, we have several TCP and UDP ports that are open. And from a different machine, I just started sending a series of pings towards this honeypot's IP address. And we can start to see those ICMP requests coming in. And after it receives enough of those, within a certain period of time, that's going to exceed a threshold where the honeypot software is going to alert us that it thinks it's under a DOS, a denial of service attack. And there it is. It alerts us that we're under a denial of service attack. Next, I'm going to point a browser to this honeypot. And it's going to alert us that there may be a SYN scan attack going on. And a SYN scan attack happens when an attacker is scanning a range of ports to check to see if there's a response from that port or not, but they're not fully establishing a connection. And we're starting to see several of those SYN scan attack messages. Now let's take a look at the built-in signature database of the different things that KF Sensor is looking for. Let's scroll through those and notice we've got the option of adding or deleting a signature. So that's a quick look at the operation of one type of honeypot software, as well as a list of strategies for detecting honeypots.